Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let me call to order the Finance and Governors Committee for April 12, 2022. And Madam Clerk, roll call and posting of the agenda.
Member Basua,
Here.
Member Tehran,
Here.
Chair Zaragoza.
Here.
The agenda for this meeting was posted on the City Hall Bulletin Board on April 5th, 2022. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And please follow me for the salute to our flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Okay, our next item is public comments not on the agenda. And we have one speaker here. I'm not sure if we have any on the phone, but we have James Lavery. Got 3 minutes.
Back, thank you.
Thank you, James.
Mhm. One of the things that the city tries to do every year is get the certificate of excellence in financial reporting. The city is proud to get this award, and it's put out by the Government Finance Officers Association out of Chicago, which is probably the preeminent promoter of best financial practices for local governments in the country. So when I found out a few weeks ago that the city did a presentation on the possibility of issuing pension obligation bonds. So that kind of dismayed me very much, because if this didn't come out in the presentation, or I don't know if anybody's aware, I'm not claiming anything, but the same organization, the Government Finance Officers Association, recommends that local governments do not issue pension obligation bonds under any economic cycle. Never, under no circumstances. This declaration occurred in 2015 after cities lost tons of money doing risky pension obligation bonds when the stock market crashed. What's even more important is that the organization reaffirmed this recommendation just last year in February of 2021. So why would they do that? Well, cities have to put the money they take out of these bonds somewhere. If they put them back in, say you put money, the presentation said last week that because of investment earnings in PERS, the city could go from $323 million liability, unfunded liability, to $250 million. But let's turn that on its head. What happens if the city issued pension obligation bonds and the stock market crashed and the liability went from 250 to 323? Then you'd still owe all those pension payments, and then you owe another $70 million. You don't have to believe me. Look what happened to Stockton, San Bernardino. This helped them go bankrupt. It wasn't the only reason, but it contributed to the reason. And there are other ways to reduce pensions that weren't discussed at the presentation. How about just
30
making it?
seconds.
How about making an extra payment? The state of California last year put in $10 billion into its pension obligation. There's things called Fresh Start, which weren't even discussed, which is lowering your amortization schedule. There's plenty of things you can do. And other things too is, if the city has all this money for Measure E, why does it even need to consider doing this? It should be able to pay its bills. That's why people voted for Measure E. Thank you.
Thank you, James. And you know, the city council then sent that back to staff for a study. So we have not approved that yet. So we're looking at the different options, but thank you for sharing.
All right, thank you.
Thank you so much. Madam Clerk, do we have any other speakers?
We do not have any additional speakers on this item. Thank you.
So we, the 3 minutes, Mr. City Attorney? We're done? Okay, good. Our next item is item C. This is the City Clerk Department approval of the minutes, that the recommendation that the Finance and Governors Committee approve the minutes of March 8th, 2022 regular meeting as presented. Council members, do we have any?
I will make, I don't have any concerns.
Okay, a motion by Basua,
A second.
a second by Councilman Turan. Please vote.
Thank you. Motion passes 3-0.
Okay, thank you. Our next item is report D1. And this is the Finance Department revision of the procurement ordinance reflecting preparation of the new Tyler Menace Enterprise Resource Planning ERP financial system. A recommendation to the Finance and Governance Committee recommend to the City Council and introduce an amendment to the city's procurement ordinance in preparation for the launch of the new core financial phase by Tyler Menace. And this again was presented under Measure M, a pre-recorded presentation. And of course, if we have any questions, we have Betsy George here, to share with us any information. Do you want any additional information to share with us, Betsy?
Yeah, just to clarify that the primary purpose of doing this is to separate the execution of the purchase order from the approval of the purchase order. So in the past, for our processes, we had the purchasing manager was both approving the purchase, an approved budgeted item, of course, from the city council's budget. And then the purchasing manager was also executing the purchase order. And so what this is going to do is shift the budget approval authority to the manager that has responsibility for their area. And then the purchasing manager is still executing all of the purchase orders, reviewing them for compliance, et cetera.
So they're going to go from the purchase agent from 100 to 0. And then the department manager from 0 to 50,000. And then of course, then the department head from 5,000 to 100,000.
Yes, that's correct. And that's approval of the purchase, not execution of the purchase order, for making sure that we are following all of the policies.
And Betsy, I think one of the ideas is because they're in charge of the operational end of it, they have more of an opportunity to kind of make sure that they're in tune with the funding.
Exactly. And they're seeing it for their budget. And they do see it now in the process when we route requisitions, for instance, on our current process, they do see that. It just wasn't reflected in the ordinance that the managers were seeing it, department managers
Okay,
and department
Councilwoman
directors.
Basu. Mhm.
Thank you for that clarification. During the presentation, I got a little bit confused as far as where the shipment was going to, but it's clear it's going from the procurement manager or the person in charge to the director level in order to have those steps in between.
Yes,
So
that's correct.
Thank you for that clarification. My other question is, in regards to procurement, if it would be beneficial to increase the limit of the public works projects in order to make the projects go maybe a little bit further. I'm not even sure if that's even something that's holding up some of these public works projects or not, but maybe a consideration would be maybe to increase maybe even our city managers signing authority to 250 and also do the same with our public works.
And that's something we could take back. We just brought in a new purchasing manager. And so we were going to bring back the ordinance with possible other amendments later in the fall.
And Councilwoman, the 200,000 limit on the, construction contracts is a state limit.
Mm.
So that we will not be able to change, but certainly there's other areas in public works that we can look at. And we have the public works director here also to look at with us and think through, for example, maintenance contracts or so forth.
Yeah, so I would like to see, the ability to give our public works director and our city manager a little bit more of a, cushion there in order to get some of these contracts done more, instead of them coming back to us and so forth. And I know our city manager has been really good at least at notifying us when he does do those execution amounts. So something I would like to see happen.
Okay, thank you, Councilmember Turan.
No questions this time. Thank you, Mayor.
Okay, so I see no problem. I think they're the operation managers and it's more probably more appropriate for them to be executing those documents. So what's the pleasure?
I'll second.
Okay, first, I get a first by Councilman Su, a second by Councilman Turan. Please vote. What's that?
Motion passes 3-0. Thank you.
Oh, then do we have any speakers on this item?
We do not have any speakers on this item. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Or then our next item is the Finance Department. This is adopt a resolution approving the Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, the WIFIA, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, loan from the U.S. Governmental Protection Agency, EPA. The recommendation, the Finance and Governance Committee recommend that one, the City Council adopt a resolution approving an installment purchase agreement indenture of the trust of WIFIA loan agreement and the WFIA loan term sheet and respect to the issuance of the City of Oxnard Finance Authority of the bonds in aggregate principal amount not to exceed $55 million and other matters pertaining thereto. And also two, that the Board of Directors of the Oxnard Finance and Authority adopt a resolution approving the installation purchase agreement, indenture of trust with the WIFIA loan agreement and the WIFIA loan term sheet with respect to the issuance of the City of Oxnard Finance Authority of the bonds in an aggregate principal amount not to exceed $55 million and other matters pertaining thereto. And Betsy, you're going to give us a presentation on this.
Yes, thank you, Mayor
Okay.
Zaragoza. We
Mhm.
have our financial advisors here on online to give the presentation. Christian Springer, who I know you're familiar with from NHA Advisors, and then also if there's any questions related to the project itself, we have Mr. Wolf from Public
Thank-
Works here.
Thank you, Christian. Go ahead.
Thank you, Betsy. Good afternoon, Mayor Zaragoza and council members. My name is Christian Sprunger, Assistant Vice President with NHA Advisors. My colleague Craig Hill is also here for tonight's meeting. We're the city's municipal financial advisors. I am sharing my screen now, so bear with me a moment. Okay, I've begun sharing my screen. I hope you can see it.
Yeah, we can see it. Mhm.
Great, thank you. Tonight this afternoon, I'll be talking to you about the Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act loan, also known as WIFIA loan. This item is a continuation of an item that came before City Council back in September of 2021, so a little over 6 months ago. As you just read, the recommendation tonight is twofold. That the Finance and Governance Committee recommend not only the City Council, but also the Board of Directors of the Financing Authority adopt a resolution approving a $55 million not to exceed amount for the loan and approving the documents related to that, the installment purchase agreement, the indenture of trust, the WIFIA loan agreement, and the WIFIA term sheet. To give a little bit of background, the WIFIA program was authorized back in 2014, and the purpose was to help local agencies finance water infrastructure projects. The program is administered by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. The city submitted a letter of interest back in October of 2020, and then was invited to formally apply and submitted a formal application in September of 2021, following a city council approval of that application in September of 2021. Since the application was submitted and from October 2021 till now, city staff and EPA staff have had regular calls to coordinate a closing and funding of the loan estimated for mid-May, pending all the approvals, of course. To provide a little bit of background on the water infrastructure that will be financed with the loan, it will finance a significant portion of the aquifer storage and recovery project. Additionally, it will be used toward effectively doubling the treatment capacity of the advanced water purification facility. It will be used for mechanical and electrical upgrades at the water blending stations. And then finally, it will be used for a 20-inch diameter pipeline for distribution of water. These projects in total are expected to cost approximately $85 million. And the WIFIA loan can cover up to 49% of the eligible costs. The other 51% will come from matching funds. That could look like city cash, future bonds, or potentially grants if those happen. The WIFIA loan presents several advantages to traditional water bonds sold to the public. First of all, this loan will have a 40-year term The public markets traditionally have a 30-year maximum term limitation, although sometimes on rare occasions, a public bond can go 35 years. But this 40-year term for the WIFIA loan is unique to government agency loans. Second, this loan will have a low fixed interest rate that's based on the yield for a similar term U.S. Treasury. As a result, the city will enjoy a much lower interest rate than the city could achieve on your own through a traditional borrowing. The number I have up here on the screen is estimated 3%. As of Friday, EPA let me know that the rate is probably somewhere around 2.6%. So I have a conservative number up here on the screen, but of course that's subject to change until we lock in the rate right before we close in mid-May.
Christian, a quick question.
Yeah.
When can we lock that rate?
So-
Potentially, we don't want to lock now because it's less, but.
So unlike the equipment lease that was done with Bank of America, where we could lock it several months in advance, the EPA says we can only lock it the day we close. So that will be mid-May. So that's once, I'll get to the schedule on a couple of slides, but once we go to council in early May, we're going to accelerate to close as quickly as possible to minimize interest rate risk.
Other quick question. What if the interest rate is 4% in May? Then what?
The city has the option not to secure the loan if that were to happen. Given that these are based on the U.S. Treasury rates for a 30-year Treasury, to move from a 2.5% to a 4% would be a pretty drastic move and pointing to some significant market turmoil. There is risk that the rate could go up. The numbers that I put in front of you estimate or use a 3% rate. Currently, the rate's a little lower than that.
Okay, thank you. Mhm.
Of course, yeah. The third bullet point here, flexible structuring. Because this is not a publicly issued debt, there is a lot of flexibility with how the loan is structured. And so we plan to wrap the amortization or the repayment of this loan around the outstanding water fund debt. I'll show you a graph in a couple slides that illustrates that visually. Finally, the EPA and the Whitfield loan provide really flexible repayment terms. These are more flexible than the standard public market repayment terms in that the city could prepay the loan in full on any date, or could prepay a portion of a loan or make additional payments on any regularly scheduled payment date. Given the anticipated interest rate, as I mentioned right now, it's around a 2.6. I'm using a 3% estimate for purposes of tonight's numbers that I'm speaking to you about. It's unlikely that the loan is refinanced for savings in the future, but we do think it's important to preserve the flexibility to restructure the debt if needed, given that this is a 40-year loan.
If Christian, my apologies. If you refi, there's what is the prepayment penalty on this?
There is no prepayment penalty. So the city could refinance in full on any date, could refinance in part on any regularly scheduled payment date. So really, really flexible prepayment terms.
Great, thank you. Mhm.
Yeah, of course.
Mhm.
So beside these advantages, the four key advantages I spoke about a moment ago, there are two things, two stipulations that come with the Whitfield loan. So first of all, I mentioned it before, but the Whitfield loan can only cover up to 49% of the eligible project costs, project and financing costs. And so the other 51% will come from either a future bond financing, potentially in 2024, or it could come from a cash balance or a combination of bonds and cash, or alternative funding sources like grants or below market rate loans. So there is a 51% requirement that the city come up with this matching fund. The second point is that, so the city's outstanding water fund debt has a debt service coverage requirement. This was when the bonds that are outstanding currently were sold to the public, the city said, we will maintain net revenues sufficient to pay 100% of debt service. The EPA wants to have a little bit of a cushion or a buffer in there. And so they're asking the city to maintain net revenues equal to 110% of debt service. The city is still only making the 100% of debt service payment to the EPA, to the government, but there's that additional small buffer in there just in case there was a shortfall in budgeted versus actuals. And so they just ask for that, that additional 110% coverage requirement.
I'm sorry, just for my clarification, the 110% of the debt, this is not 100% of the operating budget or anything like that, right?
So if I could provide an example, let's say in any given year, the debt service was $1 million, just to use a round number. The city would be required to have net revenues equivalent to $1.1 million. Even though you'd only be making the $1 million payment, the city would be required to have net revenues, to budget for net revenues. And so it could require the city to reduce expenses in the water fund, operating expenses. It could require an increase in revenues through water rate increases. I do want to say, though, that in fiscal year 21, the city's coverage was 1.67 times, so well in excess of that minimum requirement that the WIFIA loan is requiring. So we don't really expect it to be an issue going forward, but we do want to identify that as a change that the WIFIA loan is going to require, and that future water bonds the city may issue will need to use that same structure, since it will effectively be they'll all be on parity with each other, and so they'll need to use the same coverage requirement.
At 110.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. Next slide graphically shows the expected structure of the WIFIA loan. Those are the orange bars you see there. The aggregate outstanding debt service on the other water fund bonds, those are the gray bars. And so you can see that the orange bars, they increase once the lion's share of those gray bars drop off in fiscal year 2040. So that's what we would call a wraparound structure. We're wrapping around the outstanding debt of the water fund. The reason for this structure is really to lessen the requirements to raise water rates to maintain the required coverage. That's the objective with that. With regard to the schedule, after tonight's Finance and Governance Committee meeting, we'll take the WIFIA loan documents before City Council on May 3rd. Pending their approval, we would work quickly with EPA to close the loan, lock the interest rate by mid-May, currently aiming for May 11th. To conclude, recap the twofold recommendation for tonight that both the City Council and the Board of Directors of the Oxnard Financing Authority adopt a resolution authorizing the issuance of the bonds, $55 million not to exceed amount, and also the four documents listed there: the installment purchase agreement, the indenture of trust, the WIFIA loan agreement, and then the WIFIA term sheet. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and take any additional questions.
So I'm sure that Councilman Sharon.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Sprunger, for the presentation. I have a couple of questions. One was already asked by the mayor, so I appreciate that. I think these might be best suited for our staff. First would be, I'm guessing, our Public Works Director regarding the three items that were identified there: the ASR wells, the AWPF, and the blending stations. I'm wondering if you could briefly explain for the public what those three capital assets are and what their purpose is to the ratepayers.
Sure. Good evening, committee members. Michael Wolf, Director of Public Works. So the Aquifer storage and recovery system is an opportunity for us to take treated water and put it back into the sort of our groundwater or our basin here that we're able to draw upon. So that's a pretty technically involved process. The construction of it, which is actively going on right now, would then be followed up with permitting from the state. But basically, we're taking treated water and then pushing it into that well area, what we would consider to be injecting them into the groundwater and then be able to extract it back out as potable water, just like we do today with just regular groundwater. So it's kind of an opportunity for us to sort of increase that groundwater from a different source rather than just percolation. So that's that aquifer storage and recovery system. The second component of that you mentioned was the blending stations and the piping associated with that. So we take different sources of water, whether they're from our own groundwater, from import water from the state, or other groundwater that gets provided to us from other agencies. We use that water for our potable water delivery throughout the city. So some of those need to be blended in order to meet requirements from the state in terms of, I'll give you an example of total dissolved solids. We want to make sure we don't exceed a certain requirement set by the state. So we use these blending stations to make sure that we meet our requirements, but also provide the volume of water necessary for different areas. We don't have any storage, which is unique to Oxnard. We don't have any above ground storage. So we are kind of a pay as you go or deliver as you go system. So those blending stations also allow us to make sure we have volume and capacity necessary for that. So those are all the components that would be making up any traditional delivery of water. The piping and the blending stations would be that typical delivery for day-to-day operations.
All right. And the other component there, which is related, is the advanced water purification facility. And if you could just very briefly have folks, I know it's very technical, but understand the purpose of that facility and what it looks like.
We can spend hours on this discussion, couldn't we?
Mhm.
Very unique system. It's an opportunity for us to take treated water and turn it into recycled water for different kinds of uses. So it's a facility that sits adjacent to our wastewater treatment plant. It takes the product after the wastewater treatment plant has done its due diligence, if you will, to get it to a certain level, takes that water and then goes through another step, a multiple step process to turn that into recycled water that's able to be used for recycled waterable sources, whether that's irrigating landscaping or irrigating crops. So that AWPF is that system that provides that next level of recovery and treatment of that water to be able to be delivered for those services.
All right. Thank you.
Councilmember, can I add a little bit to that?
Yes.
My apologies, but that's also going to help with the saltwater intrusion, right? It's my understanding that was the AWPF was also built for that reason, to keep the saltwater from intrusion and also the recycled water.
Well, for injection purposes, or the saltwater intrusion that's coming from the ocean.
From the ocean.
So I'm not sure I've ever heard that as part of the AWPF
I heard it from.
goal.
The only component that I've heard of that is if we inject, as Michael was saying about the ASR wells, if we inject our water in and the
In the wells.
basin's water levels rise very high, then the seawater intrusion is less likely to happen because we're basically thwarting off the seawater levels.
But that'll help us with that too.
So from a
Potentially.
hydrology standpoint, obviously the basin is that protection from the
Right.
seawater intrusion. The lower the basin goes, the more potential of that influx is what they call it. The more potential that influx from the seawater. So the more that we can keep the basin up to its normal levels.
That stops it.
Correct.
Okay,
So
my-
yes.
My apologies.
Yes. Thank you, Mayor. And I ask about those, number one, so that the public who hasn't heard about it yet has the opportunity to get an idea of what it is that's in front of us and what we're looking at for this Whitfield loan. And I think it's important to state, one of the questions I had was at 110% coverage of the debt service. My question was, do we have the ability to do so at current rates? And it sounds like we're actually at that and then some. And I'm happy to hear that. But with these items we're talking about actually financing, number one, they have the potential to help us as this decade goes on and water becomes more of a scarcity and an issue regionally, not just for our city, where we're now able to produce our own potable water through this system. but does it also have the potential to generate revenue for the city through this system if we're able to take on additional capacity from nearby jurisdictions who would like to send their wastewater to our system and then into the AWPF? Is there potential for that?
So the whole GREAT program, as described in the staff report, is that overarching program. And so as part of that, the influx or the amount of wastewater that we can push towards the AWPF only increases the amount of water that we can produce. So from that standpoint, the more volume that we can produce from AWPF, the more opportunity there is to sell that water. Whether that's to just our customers, or maybe there's a regional approach from a groundwater management standpoint. There's certainly a lot of those opportunities to explore. But the more water that we can produce, which we call new source of water, right? So like you say, getting scarcer and scarcer. So those new sources of water are and other agencies that I've worked for are very, very unique. So Orange County Water District has their very similar program. So those new sources of water are an opportunity for us to sell those either to our customers or some regional approach.
Thank you for that. And it's difficult for me to understate this, but I hope that folks will recognize that we're now in 2022. As this decade goes on, water is going to be a major issue for us as a city, as a region, as an entire portion of the United States. And as a city, we are working very diligently to stay ahead of that curve and make sure that the availability of water is there for our ratepayers, for our residents, and also, as you mentioned, Mr. Wolf, possibly a regional approach for our neighboring jurisdictions who may want to jump onto this as well and do so at a way that benefits the city of Oxnard and its residents. So, and did you have something, Ms. Kleeman?
Sorry, I wanted to add, Councilmember, you're absolutely right. This is a really critical goal for the city, but also you mentioned we have the funding right now in water. We do for the 110%, but Mr. Wolf can talk about it more. We do have the AMI project that is going to be spending down a significant amount of that cash. So I don't want you to think that
we have the
we're
money.
certainly not flush.
Yeah, thank you for that. I was actually going to maybe inject a little bit that while today's the debt coverage is good, I do want to remind that we have that not only the great program, but that we have other operational and maintenance, deferred maintenance activities. The AMI is a great example of something that's needed that'll start to draw down some of that funding, and we need to make sure we're looking at those in the future as we look at our rates to make sure we can sustain not just the great program and the indirect potable water reuse, but just day-to-day operations of the system. These are very technical and very advanced systems that have a lot of, variable frequency drives and membranes, things like that, that just need to be maintained. And so, those are the things that we're going to have to be doing going forward as well. That will cost them some money.
Thank you for that context. All right, and those are my questions. Thank you.
I think the other, you had some other items. You're going to construct 6 ASR wells, and also one's going to be a demo, and the other one is 5 full scale. Is the current ASR well that we're doing, is that going to be a demo? Is that okay? And then
Yes, Mr. Mayor, that's the demonstration.
then we need the 5 additional. And also they talked about a 20-inch diameter distribution pipeline to convey the recovered groundwater from the ASR wells to 3 existing water blending stations, 1, 3, and 6. Where is 1, 3, and 6? Where are those wells at?
That is a great question. I certainly can get back to you on that. I have not memorized that in the 6 months I've been here, but we can get back to you on that, Mr. Mayor.
And also talk about the mechanical, electrical upgrades to the blending stations, and also the piping modifications. And that's a lot of things that we needed to do in the past that we're not going to be doing, which I think is not just the 55 million is going to go for X, but it's going to go for Y and so forth, which I think is extremely important.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, so that's a great point. I mean, we can look at this as a very large project, but there's still a lot of small components that have to operate every day, every second of the day. Those often get installed and we do the routine maintenance, but they have a useful life. Those things need to get replaced at some point in time. So, these blending stations, these pumps, all the membranes, those things obviously have a useful life that require replacement, even after we've done the preventative maintenance on them.
And again, this is a tremendous amount of money, and the mandates that we have here to have 110% of the debt each year, that's very, very significant. That we really have to do some really good accounting for that, Betsy, to make sure that we are right up to speed and we don't fall behind in this. What are the penalties if we don't have that one debt, 110% debt availability?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Mayor. I'm Betsy George, Chief Financial Officer, and we have, with NHA's assistance, we've been modeling up to 20 or 30 years. We may have gone out all 40 years for this to look at the coverage, and it looks like we will not fall below the 110%. And the penalties, I'm going to ask Mr. Springer to give the exact penalties because I'm not familiar.
Okay.
Yeah, certainly. It would be what's known as it would be essentially what's known as a covenant default. So the city would be required to engage a consultant to come on and assist that the next year, assist with evaluating the revenue structure and the expense structure, so that the next year the city can meet that coverage. The city would still make the debt service payment as scheduled. So the money would get over to the EPA for the Whitfield loan. But the city would be required to engage someone to assist with evaluating the rate structure, evaluating expenses, revenues, and so that the next budget cycle and the next year the city could meet that 110% requirement.
And I think that's something important to the city manager and staff, is that we make sure we project that if we're going to need a rate increase. I personally don't want to wait 4 or 5 years and say, hey, we're going to have to increase rates by 50% or whatever. We need to look at our rates so people can understand that what we're doing here is very significant for the future. And we're going to have this ASR wells, our money in the bank, water in the bank that we're going to need in the future. We've got to make sure that if we're going to need rates, that we be straightforward with the public and say we need rates because of X, Y, and Z. What you're doing here is extremely important. All the ASR wells, the upgrades of the pipeline, the distribution line, the blending stations. Those things are money in the bank that we need wet water. So it's like, to me, it's like having money in the bank for a rainy day, and here for water, which is really important.
Yes, absolutely. And we're working in finance, working closely with Public Works and the city manager and making sure that we're forecasting and have lots of lead time if we need to make those recommendations and do those studies.
And also, it really has nothing to do with this item, but I just want to share with our Public Works Director and our city manager that the council member and I had the opportunity to make a tour, to do a tour of the wastewater plant and also of the AWBF plant. And you have some very, very good people working out there, very, conscientious individuals. And I learned a lot, even though I've been a city employee for 200 years. But when you go out there and you see the intricacy, the engineering, what they have to do, just phenomenal. That people need to understand that. And also to submit the money over to, the water over to the AWPF. That unit is really, really fantastic. It's really something that once a lot of this pandemic is over, we need to have the open houses out there so people can understand the intricacy. And this is a health and safety issue of what we're doing now, which is really, really important. But you have really good staff out there. So I want to commend Jen and also Mr. Castro for the good work they're doing. So, okay, so any speakers on this item, Madam Clerk?
We do not have any speakers. Thank you, Mayor.
And our 3 minutes are up. We need a motion this item. Do we need a motion, or it's just a receive and file?
We have some recommendations. I'll move the recommended action.
Recommendations, okay. Okay, and second by Basua. Roll call. Or we'll vote.
Motion passes 3-0. Thank you.
And again, thank you. It's just a really complex information. It's a tremendous amount of money that that potentially we send it to the city council. Thank you so much. So our next item on the agenda is any future items for the governor's committee? No.
No items at this time, Mayor.
Okay, so we are adjourned and we'll see you at 8:30. Thank you.